When a new patient arrived at the dentist's clinic, accompanied by what seemed to be her boyfriend, the doctor immediately sensed that something was off. As she sat in the chair and opened her mouth, the dentist gasped at what he saw. The young woman had no teeth, only metal implants and swollen gums remained. After a failed attempt to help her during the appointment, the dentist made a bold decision to follow her after work. What he discovered revealed a horrifying truth far worse than he could have imagined. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets of Sacramento, its golden light softening the edges of the buildings and painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. At precisely 5 p.m., Dr. Paul Revere stood in the doorway of his private dental practice, a converted Victorian house that had seen better days but still maintained an air of quiet dignity. The 50-year-old dentist's salt-and-pepper hair caught the fading sunlight as he bid farewell to his last scheduled patient of the day. "Thank you again, doctor," the patient said, adjusting his jaw as if testing out the feeling of his newly cleaned teeth. "I always dread coming to the dentist, but you make it bearable." Paul smiled warmly, the corners of his eyes crinkling behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "That's what I'm here for. Remember, floss daily, and I'll see you in 6 months." As the patient made his way down the worn concrete steps, Paul's attention was drawn to 2 figures approaching from the opposite direction. A man and a woman, walking close together, but with a palpable tension between them. There was something about their demeanor that caught Paul's eye, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Dr. Paul's eyes crinkled slightly behind his wire-rimmed glasses as he observed the couple. Years of experience had honed his ability to read people, and something about this couple set off a quiet alarm in the back of his mind. With a slight shake of his head, he turned back into the clinic, making his way to his practice room to prepare for what he assumed would be another patient. The familiar scent of antiseptic and mint greeted him as he entered the room. His nurse assistant, Rena, was already there, meticulously sanitizing the dental chair and equipment. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her movements were efficient and practiced. The methodical sounds of her work, the soft swish of disinfectant wipes, the clink of metal instruments being arranged, created a soothing rhythm that Paul had grown accustomed to over the years. As he settled behind his desk, Paul's gaze drifted to the darkened window. Through the tinted glass, he could make out the silhouettes of the man and woman he had seen earlier. They were now at the reception desk, the scratching of pen on paper audible even from where he sat. His brow furrowed as he watched the woman's posture. Her shoulders were slumped, her body language radiating discomfort and a lack of confidence. "Rena," Paul called out softly, not wanting to startle his assistant. "Have you seen those 2 before? I can't recall having them as patients." Rena paused in her work, looking up at Paul with her warm brown eyes. "No, Dr. Paul," she replied, her voice muffled slightly by her medical mask. "I believe they're first-time patients here. The receptionist would have mentioned if we had their records on file." Paul nodded, his curiosity piqued. He turned his attention back to his computer, quickly finishing up the report for his previous patient. The familiar routine of typing up notes and observations helped to ground him, even as his mind wandered back to the couple in the waiting room. Once he was done, Paul swiveled in his chair to face Rena. "Is everything ready for our next patient?" he asked, his tone professional but kind. "Yes, Dr. Paul," Rena confirmed with a nod. "All instruments are sterilized, and the chair is prepped and sanitized." With a satisfied nod, Paul refreshed the computer system. The new patient's information appeared on the screen, and he took a moment to familiarize himself with the name, Miss Mona Collins. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and made his way to the door. "Miss Mona Collins?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly into the waiting area. The woman he had observed earlier stood up, followed closely by the man who appeared to be her boyfriend. As they approached, Paul put on his most welcoming smile, gesturing for them to enter the practice room. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow, accentuating the nervous expression on Mona's face. As they entered, the boyfriend immediately spoke up, his tone brooking no argument. I need a chair. I'm staying with her during the examination. Paul noticed Rena's slight frown, her disapproval evident even behind her mask. She pulled a chair to the corner of the room, but the man adjusted it, moving it closer to the dental chair where Mona was settling in. Paul cleared his throat, his professionalism kicking in despite the odd tension in the room. "Sir, I'll need some space to work. Would you mind moving back a bit?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. The boyfriend's expression darkened momentarily, but he complied, albeit reluctantly. Paul exhaled slowly, centering himself. He had dealt with all sorts of patients and situations over the years, so he shouldn't let this one unnerved him. Pushing all negative thoughts aside, he focused on the task at hand, providing care for the woman in front of him. The soft hum of the overhead light filled the room as Dr. Paul switched on his headlamp, the bright beam illuminating Mona's face. He slipped on a pair of latex gloves, the material snapping against his wrists with a familiar sound. The cool, sterile scent of the gloves mingled with the antiseptic air of the examination room, creating an atmosphere that was at once clinical and oddly comforting. Rena, ever efficient, handed Paul his mouth mirror. The metal was cool against his palm, even through the latex barrier of his gloves. Paul could feel the weight of the boyfriend's gaze on him, heavy and oppressive in the small room. "All right, Miss Collins," Paul said, his voice gentle and reassuring. He modulated his tone carefully, aware of the tension radiating from both Mona and her companion. "Could you please open your mouth for me?" Mona complied, her movements hesitant. As Paul leaned in, the beam from his headlamp revealing the interior of her mouth, he felt his breath catch in his throat. Where he had expected to see teeth, there was nothing but empty gums. The pink tissue was marred with metal implants, a stark reminder of teeth long gone. Paul's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. In all his years of practice, he had never encountered a case quite like this in someone so young. He glanced at Mona's face, noting the fear and embarrassment in her eyes. They were a deep, rich brown, but clouded with an emotion Paul couldn't quite place. Was it shame, fear, or something else entirely? "Miss Collins," he said, his voice carefully controlled. He was acutely aware of the boyfriend's presence, a looming shadow in the periphery of his vision. "Can you tell me how this happened?" Mona's eyes darted to her boyfriend before she answered. Paul noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the armrests of the dental chair. When she spoke, her voice was breathy and difficult to understand without teeth. "I had a really bad accident a few months ago," she began, her words slurred and hesitant. "I was ice skating, trying to catch my balance after slipping. I fell and knocked all my teeth out." Paul's brow furrowed. Ice skating? In Sacramento and in this weather? The explanation seemed implausible, but before he could voice his confusion, the boyfriend chimed in. "It was at an indoor ice skating rink," he explained, his tone casual but firm. Paul winced, imagining the pain of such a fall. The image of Mona's face colliding with unforgiving ice flashed through his mind, making him shudder internally. "That must have been terribly painful," he said sympathetically. "You're lucky you didn't bite your tongue. In accidents like that, it's not uncommon to lose more than just teeth." The woman's eyes widened in fear, but her boyfriend chuckled, the sound oddly out of place in the tense atmosphere of the room. Paul's unease grew, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. As he continued his examination, Paul noticed the telltale signs of previous dental work. The metal implants in Mona's gums were evidence of a procedure that should have resulted in a full set of functioning teeth. Yet here she was, completely toothless. "I see you've had implants before," he observed, keeping his tone neutral. "Can you tell me about that?" Mona nodded, her eyes once again flicking to her boyfriend before she spoke. Paul noticed the subtle shift in her body language, the way she seemed to shrink into herself even more. "Last month I had all my teeth repaired and got fake teeth put in," she explained haltingly. "But it was poorly done. The implants started to fall out and some even broke. We didn't want to go back to that dentist, so that's why we came here." Paul's concern deepened. While it wasn't unheard of for dental work to fail, the extent of the damage he was seeing was unusual, to say the least. He needed more information. "Can you tell me how you lost all your fake teeth?" he asked gently, aware of the delicate nature of the situation. Mona hesitated, her gaze once again seeking out her boyfriend. Paul noticed the almost imperceptible eyebrow nod the man gave, as if granting permission for her to speak. "It was during a barbecue last month," she said finally. "I was chewing tough meats and corn and they started to loosen. That night I found my teeth were shaky, and by morning they had fallen out." Paul considered her explanation. While not impossible, it was highly improbable for even poorly done implants to fail so catastrophically from normal eating. Still, he didn't want to dismiss her story outright. "Do you grind your teeth when you sleep?" he asked, searching for any additional factors that might explain the extensive damage. I don't know," Mona replied, her voice small and uncertain. "Please, can you just fix my teeth? I've been eating nothing but watery food for a month." The desperation in her voice tugged at Paul's heart. Whatever the true cause of her dental issues, it was clear that Mona was suffering. As a healthcare professional, his primary duty was to help her, regardless of the circumstances that had led her to this point. Paul glanced between Mona and her boyfriend, acutely aware of the man's watchful gaze. The situation was far from normal, but he pushed his suspicions aside. For now, his focus had to be on examining and fixing Mona's teeth. Without proper dental function, she would be at risk of malnutrition and other health issues. With that in mind, he leaned in to take a closer look at the remnants of Mona's previous dental work, determined to find a solution to her immediate problem. As he continued the examination, the clinical silence of the praxis room was broken only by the soft whir of the air conditioning and the occasional clink of dental instruments. Dr. Paul leaned in closer, his trained eyes scrutinizing every detail of the metal implants embedded in Mona's gums. After several minutes of thorough observation, Paul straightened up, removing his gloves with a soft snap. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room, causing Mona to flinch slightly. Paul took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts before speaking. The weight of what he was about to say settled heavily on his shoulders. "Miss Collins," he began, his tone professional yet compassionate. He chose his words carefully, aware of the boyfriend's watchful gaze. "To do this properly, we'll need to remove the existing metal implants. This will require sedation." Mona's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing her face. Paul continued, his voice steady and reassuring. "After that, we'll put in new all-on-4 implants for both jaws. This is a comprehensive solution that will—" Before he could finish his explanation, the boyfriend interjected, his voice low but carrying an undercurrent of barely suppressed anger. "Just hurry up and get it done," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "We've already wasted enough time and money." Paul paused, taken aback by the man's abrupt interruption. He glanced at the boyfriend, noting the tense set of his shoulders and the way his fingers drummed impatiently on the arm of his chair. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken tension. "I understand your concern," Paul said calmly, addressing the boyfriend. He maintained eye contact, his voice level despite the unease churning in his stomach. "However, this is a complex procedure that requires careful planning and execution. Rushing it could lead to complications." The boyfriend's jaw clenched visibly, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "How much?" he demanded, his tone brusque. Paul took a moment to collect his thoughts, mentally calculating the expenses involved. He was acutely aware of the delicate balance he needed to strike, providing accurate information while navigating the palpable tension in the room. "The metal removal and sedation would be $1,000, he began, keeping his tone neutral. "Then, for the full-mouth dental implants, the most cost-effective option is to use 4 to 6 implants per arch, that's for the upper and lower jaw, to support a permanent denture. The all-on-4 implants for both jaws will cost $40,000. This is actually the cheapest option. Individual implants for all teeth would double the price." As Paul spoke, he watched the boyfriend's face darken, his expression morphing from impatience to barely contained fury. The man's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Mona, still reclined in the dental chair, seemed to shrink into herself, her eyes darting nervously between Paul and her boyfriend. The silence that followed Paul's explanation was deafening. He could hear the soft hum of the equipment, the muffled sounds of traffic outside, and his own heart pounding in his ears. The tension in the room was palpable, like a tightly coiled spring ready to snap at any moment. Finally, the boyfriend spoke, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "All right," he said, the word coming out like a growl. "Let's just get this over with." Paul nodded, relieved that the tension seemed to be dissipating, if only slightly. He knew, however, that they were far from out of the woods. "Of course," he said, his voice calm and professional. "However, given the extent of the procedure and its cost, we'll need to handle the payment details first. If you could follow Nurse Rena to the reception area, we can take care of that while I prepare for the procedure." The boyfriend stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made Mona flinch. Paul watched as he followed Rena out of the room, his gait stiff and his hands clenched at his sides. As soon as they rounded the corner, Paul quickly closed the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of concern and determination. He turned back to Mona, who sat small and vulnerable in the large dental chair. Now was his chance to get to the bottom of this situation. As he approached her, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The makeup on Mona's cheek had smudged slightly where his glove had rested on her cheek earlier, revealing the edge of what looked unmistakably like a bruise. In that moment, all the pieces began to fall into place. The woman's nervousness, the boyfriend's controlling behavior, the improbable story about the lost teeth. Paul's medical training and years of experience told him that he was looking at a case of domestic abuse. He knew he had to act quickly. The boyfriend would only be gone for a short time, and this might be his only chance to help the woman. Dr. Paul's heart raced as he looked at Mona, her small form dwarfed by the large dental chair. He pulled up his stool, sitting down beside Mona at eye level. The overhead light cast shadows across her face, accentuating the hollows under her eyes and the tension in her jaw. Paul took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Miss Collins," he began gently, his voice barely above a whisper. The quietness of his tone seemed to fill the room, creating an intimate bubble around them. "I need you to tell me the truth." He paused, watching Mona's face for any reaction. "I noticed the bruise under your makeup. Is everything all right at home?" Mona's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing her face before she quickly composed herself. Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, began to fidget with the hem of her shirt. "Everything I told you is the truth, Doctor. Revere," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "Nothing is wrong. My boyfriend, he's a loving man." Paul's heart sank at her denial, but he pressed on, driven by a mix of professional duty and genuine concern. "I understand you're scared," he said softly. He wanted to reach out, to offer some physical comfort, but he knew that might be too much. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice low and earnest. "But I want you to know that you don't have to be. I'm here to help you, and this can stop now. You're safe here." Mona remained silent, her eyes fixed on her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Paul could see the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her knuckles turned white from the force of her grip. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching out in the tense silence. Paul took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he needed to ask next. "Mona," he said, using her first name to establish a more personal connection, "was it your boyfriend who did this to your teeth? Did he hurt you?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Paul held his breath, watching Mona's face for any reaction. He could see the internal struggle playing out in her eyes, fear, shame, and something that might have been a flicker of hope. Finally, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. The confirmation hit Paul like a physical blow. Despite his suspicions, hearing it confirmed made the situation all too real. He felt a surge of anger towards the man who's currently in the reception, mixed with an overwhelming desire to protect the vulnerable woman before him. "I'm going to call the police now," Paul said, his voice firm but gentle. He needed to convey both authority and compassion. "Everything will be okay. I'll support you through this, and the police will take my word very seriously because I'm a medical expert. Mona looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something that might have been hope. She didn't speak, but she didn't object either. Paul took that as tacit permission to proceed. With steady hands that belied his inner turmoil, Paul walked to his desk and picked up the landline phone. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he dialed 911, his eyes never leaving Mona as he waited for the call to connect. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice came through the line, a lifeline in the storm of emotions swirling through the room. This is Dr. Paul Revere at Revere Dental Clinic on 5th Street, Paul began, his voice low but clear. He was acutely aware of Mona watching him, her body tense as if ready to flee at any moment. I have a patient here who I believe is a victim of domestic abuse. Her boyfriend is in the waiting room and... Suddenly the door burst open with a bang that made both Paul and Mona jump. The boyfriend stood in the doorway, his face contorted with rage. Behind him, Raina was trying to pull him back, her usually calm demeanor replaced by panic. What the hell is going on here? The boyfriend demanded, his eyes darting between Paul and Mona. Who told you to close the door? His voice directed to Dr. Paul, not Mona. The air in the room seemed to crackle with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. Paul's grip on the phone tightened, the dispatcher's voice still audible, asking if everything was all right and whether he still needed police assistance. Time seemed to stretch as he watched the boyfriend stride into the room, seizing Mona's arm with a rough grip. We're leaving. Now, he growled, pulling Mona from the chair. She stumbled, her face a mask of fear and resignation. Paul's training kicked in, overriding his shock. Yes, please send officers right away, he said quickly into the phone before hanging up. He then turned to the man, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Sir, I need you to stay where you are, Paul said firmly, his eyes locked on the man. I've seen the bruises on Miss Collins' face. The police are already on their way. The boyfriend's face twisted into a snarl as he cursed. You have no right to do this, he spat, pointing an accusing finger at Paul. His other hand maintained its vice-like grip on Mona's arm. I did nothing wrong. You'll regret this, I swear. With that, he stormed out of the room, dragging a stumbling Mona behind him. Paul rushed after them, his heart pounding. The reception area was a blur as they passed through, the startled face of the reception staff barely registering in Paul's peripheral vision. As they reached the clinic's exit, the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 police officers were already stepping out of their car, hands on their weapons. Stay where you are, one of the officers called out, his voice authoritative and firm. As the scene unfolded before him, Paul felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He stepped outside, the cool air a stark contrast to the tension-filled atmosphere of his clinic. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Paul observed as the 2 police officers remained on high alert, their hands hovering near their weapons while they took in the tense scene. The boyfriend, Eamon, as Paul had learned from Mona's trembling voice, stood stiffly, his expression a tight mask of barely restrained anger. Beside him, Mona seemed to shrink into herself, her eyes flickering anxiously between Eamon, the officers, and Paul. Officers, Paul began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. I'm Dr. Paul Revere. I called you here because I have reason to believe this woman is a victim of domestic abuse. One of the officers, a stocky man with greying hair at his temples, stepped forward. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen too much in his career. Can you tell us exactly what happened, Dr. Revere? He asked, his tone professional but tinged with a hint of weariness. Paul took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, the responsibility of his words heavy on his shoulders. Miss Collins came in for dental work. All of her teeth are missing, and when I examined her, I noticed bruising under her makeup. When I questioned her privately, she confirmed that her boyfriend, he gestured towards Amon, was responsible for her injuries. As Paul spoke, he could feel Amon's glare burning into him and Mona. The man's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Mona, by contrast, seemed to be trying to make herself as small as possible, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. Eamon's face contorted with rage. "That's a lie," he shouted, his voice echoing across the parking lot. The sudden outburst made Mona flinch visibly. "This dentist got angry because we couldn't afford his expensive treatment. He called me racist words because I'm black, and now he's making up lies to cover his tracks." Paul felt a surge of indignation at the accusation. The idea that he would use racial slurs or fabricate abuse allegations was not only false, but deeply offensive to everything he stood for as a healthcare professional. "That's absolutely not true," he countered firmly, meeting Eamon's glare with a steady gaze. "I never used any racist language. I'm simply concerned for Miss Collins' well-being." The second officer, a younger woman with sharp eyes, turned to Mona. Her voice was gentler, a stark contrast to the tension surrounding them. "Ma'am, can you tell us what really happened?" Paul watched with a mixture of hope and apprehension as Mona opened her mouth to speak. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, the air thick with anticipation. But to his shock and dismay, her words were not what he expected. "The dentist did call Amon racist words," Mona said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't meet anyone's eyes, her gaze fixed on a point in the distance. "But Amon didn't hit me. He's never been violent towards me." Paul felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. He stared at Mona in disbelief, unable to comprehend why she would lie to protect the man who had hurt her. The bruise he had seen, the fear in her eyes when she had confided in him, it all stood in stark contrast to the words she was now speaking. At that moment, Rena and the receptionist burst out of the clinic door, slightly out of breath, as if they had rushed to join the scene. "Officers," Rena called out, her usually calm demeanor replaced by urgency. "Dr. Revere never used any racial slurs. We were there the whole time." The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. The older officer sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that spoke of years of dealing with complex, often contradictory situations. "Look," he said, addressing Amon and Mona, "we're going to let you go with a warning this time. But if we get called out here again, there will be consequences. Understood?" Amon nodded curtly, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Mona remained silent, her eyes still fixed on the ground. Paul watched helplessly as the couple made their way to their car, Eamon's hand gripping Mona's arm tightly. As they drove away, Paul felt a wave of frustration and sadness wash over him. The younger officer approached Paul, her expression sympathetic but professional. "Dr. Revere, can I ask why you were so certain about the abuse? Did you see any concrete evidence beyond the bruise?" Paul sighed, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. He felt drained, the adrenaline of the confrontation giving way to a bone-deep weariness. "Officer, you should have seen her teeth, or rather the lack of them. No one loses all their teeth in an ice skating accident or from eating tough barbecue food. The excuses they gave me were clearly fabricated." The officer nodded, jotting down notes in her pad. Her pen scratched against the paper, the sound oddly loud in the now quiet parking lot. "I understand your concern, Doctor, but without the victim's cooperation or clear evidence of a crime, our hands are tied." "So that's it?" Paul asked, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. "We just let them go, knowing she's in danger?" The older officer joined them, his expression grave. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, etched with the weight of countless similar situations. "We're not dismissing your concerns, Dr. Revere. We'll keep an eye on the situation. If you notice anything else, don't hesitate to call us again. Sometimes it takes multiple interventions before a victim is ready to accept help." Paul nodded, understanding the reality of the situation even as he chafed against it. He watched as the officers returned to their vehicle, the flashing lights cutting off as they drove away. The sudden silence in the parking lot felt oppressive, filled with the weight of what had just transpired and the uncertainty of what was to come. As Paul turned back towards his clinic, he caught sight of Rena and the receptionist standing in the doorway, their faces mirroring his own concern and disappointment. The late afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot. It was a beautiful evening, but Paul could find no joy in it. His mind was filled with images of Mona, trapped in a situation she couldn't escape, and the gnawing feeling that he had somehow failed her. Despite the setback, Paul was more determined than ever to find a way to help Mona. He just hoped that when the opportunity came again, it wouldn't be too late. As he walked back into the clinic, his steps heavy with the weight of unresolved concern, he knew that this was far from over. Somehow, someway, he would find a way to help Mona escape the nightmare she was living. The fluorescent lights of the clinic seemed harsh and unforgiving as Dr. Paul made his way back inside, the weight of the recent events heavy on his shoulders. The reception area, usually a place of quiet efficiency, now felt charged with an uncomfortable energy. Rena and the administration staff stood behind the reception desk, their faces etched with concern. Paul leaned against the counter, exhaling deeply. The cool surface of the laminate countertop grounded him slightly, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions swirling within him. "I can't believe what just happened," he said, his voice low and tinged with frustration. "That poor woman, and she wouldn't even speak up for herself." Rena nodded, her usually cheerful demeanor subdued. She fiddled with a pen, clicking it absently as she spoke. "I didn't like that man from the moment he entered the room," she said, shaking her head. "There was something off about him. He didn't look like any gentleman I've ever seen." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the ensuing silence, each second a reminder of the time that had passed since Mona had left with her abuser. Paul's mind raced, replaying the events of the afternoon, searching for something he might have missed, something he could have done differently. As they stood there processing the events, the staff entrance door swung open with a soft whoosh. Robbie, another nurse on their team, walked in, his bike helmet still in hand. His cheeks were flushed from the ride, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that greeted him. He paused as he took in the tense expressions of his colleagues, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Hey, what's going on?" Robbie asked, joining them behind the reception desk. He set his helmet down with a soft thud. "Are you all talking about that woman and man who were just outside with the officers? I saw them as I was coming in." Paul looked up, surprised. "You saw them? I didn't even notice you return." Robbie shrugged, hanging his helmet on a nearby hook. The clink of metal against metal seemed oddly loud in the quiet room. "I just got back from delivering some medicine," he said casually. "I was in the parking lot by my bike. You all seemed pretty caught up in whatever was going on." There was a moment of silence before Robbie spoke again, his voice hesitant. "You know, I've seen her before. That woman, I mean." Paul's head snapped up, his attention fully on Robbie now. A spark of hope ignited in his chest. "You have? Where?" Robbie shifted uncomfortably, clearly wrestling with what he was about to say. He glanced around as if ensuring no one else could overhear, despite the empty waiting room. "A few blocks away, in a poorer area of the city. I've seen her on the streets, roaming around. I'm pretty sure she's selling services." He trailed off, his implication clear. The realization hit Paul like a physical blow. The situation was far worse than he had initially thought. Not only was Mona being abused, but she was also likely being exploited or trafficked. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, painting a picture more horrifying than he had imagined. Rena, always quick with a quip to lighten the mood, turned to Robbie with a raised eyebrow. "And how exactly do you know this, Robbie? Frequent that area often, do you?" She winked, but the jest fell flat in the heavy atmosphere. Robbie's face flushed red, the color creeping up his neck and into his cheeks. "No way," he protested, his voice rising slightly. "I just have to pass through that street on my way home. You can trust me on this." Paul barely registered the exchange, his mind racing with the implications of this new information. The clock on the wall caught his eye. 6:30 p.m. The day had slipped away, consumed by this unfolding drama. Making a quick decision, he addressed his staff. "We're closing early today," he announced, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "You can all head home. We'll resume normal hours tomorrow morning." As the staff began their closing routines, the receptionist and cashier balancing the day's accounts, Rena cleaning and sanitizing the dental equipment in the praxis room, Paul retreated to his office. The familiar space, usually a sanctuary of calm and order, now felt stifling. He gathered his belongings mechanically, his thoughts still swirling with concern for Mona and frustration at his inability to help her more effectively. The sound of the sterilization unit humming in the background was a stark reminder of the normal, everyday tasks that continued even as this extraordinary situation unfolded. As Paul watched Rena meticulously prepare the tools for the next day, he couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring, and if there was anything more he could do to help a woman trapped in a nightmare he was only beginning to understand. The last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink as Dr. Paul locked the clinic door behind him. The day's events weighed heavily on his mind, a stark contrast to the peaceful evening settling over Sacramento. He watched as his staff dispersed, their usual cheerful goodbyes subdued by the gravity of what they had witnessed. Paul made his way to his car, the familiar routine of ending his workday now tinged with an unsettling sense of unfinished business. As he settled into the driver's seat, the leather cool against his back, he pulled out his phone, noticing a text from his wife that he had missed earlier in the day. "Hey honey, feeling burnt out from work? Any chance you could come home early? Would love to go on a date night." Paul's heart clenched as he read the message. On any other day, the prospect of an impromptu date night with his wife would have been a welcome end to his workday. He could picture it clearly. Coming home, changing into something more casual. Perhaps that blue shirt she always said brought out his eyes. They would go to their favorite Italian restaurant, share a bottle of wine, and for a few hours, the stresses of their jobs would melt away. But as tempting as that scenario was, Paul couldn't shake the image of Mona's bruised face from his mind. The thought of simply going home, of trying to forget what he had seen and learned, felt like a betrayal of his oath as a healthcare professional and his duty as a human being. With a heavy sigh, Paul typed out a reply to his wife. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. There's an emergency situation I need to handle. I promise we'll go out tomorrow night, just the two of us." As he hit send, Paul felt a pang of guilt. He knew his wife would understand, she always did, but he hated disappointing her. Still, he knew he wouldn't be able to enjoy a night out with the knowledge that Mona was out there, possibly in danger. Paul started the engine, the car humming to life beneath him. But instead of taking his usual route home, he found himself heading in a different direction. The street Robbie had mentioned wasn't far, and something compelled Paul to see it for himself. He knew it was probably futile, maybe even a bit foolish, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something, anything, to help. As he drove, the neighborhoods gradually changed. The well-manicured lawns and tidy houses gave way to more run-down buildings, their paint peeling and windows dark, graffiti-adorned walls, and litter collected in gutters. Paul's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he entered the street Robbie had described. After 20 minutes of slow, deliberate driving, his eyes caught a familiar figure standing under the dull glow of a street lamp. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking her. Mona. The provocative pink dress clung to her tall, slender frame, its minimal fabric seeming out of place against the night's creeping chill. Her ebony hair cascaded down her back, glossy under the artificial light. Paul swallowed hard as he watched her step out of a car, its red taillights glowing momentarily, before the driver sped off, leaving her behind. He didn't need to guess what had just happened. The tightness in his chest told him he already knew. Paul's mind raced. Should he intervene, call the police again? Before he could decide, the car drove off, leaving Mona once again on the street corner. Then, as if on cue, a figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby alley. Amon. Paul recognized him instantly. The tense posture, the sharp features twisted into something possessive and expectant. Without hesitation, he seized Mona's arm, his grip firm, demanding. She didn't resist. Instead, she reached into the small purse dangling at her side and handed over a wad of cash. Amon counted the bills with a practiced flick of his fingers, then, with a smirk, leaned in and pressed a kiss against her lips. For a fleeting moment, Paul thought he saw her flinch, but she didn't pull away. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. Amon, seemingly satisfied, shoved her lightly back toward the curb, wordlessly instructing her to take her place once again. Mona stumbled slightly but regained her footing, her expression unreadable. She wrapped her arms around herself as though warding off the cold, her gaze flickering toward the ground. Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he watched, every instinct screaming at him to do something. But Mona didn't call for help. She didn't cry out. She simply stood there waiting. As he sat there, hidden in the growing darkness, Paul knew he couldn't simply drive away and pretend he hadn't seen this. He had to do something. As he pondered his next move and plans, he kept his eyes fixed on Mona. The streetlight near Mona flickered relentlessly, casting an eerie glow over the desolate street. From his car, Dr. Paul watched, his heart pounding with a blend of fear and determination. He had parked in a discreet spot, far enough to remain unnoticed but close enough to keep her in sight. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, activating the video camera. Through the lens of his phone, Paul watched as a sleek, luxurious black car pulled up beside Mona. The tinted windows rolled down, revealing two older men inside. Even from a distance, Paul could see the hesitation in Mona's body language. She clearly didn't want to get into the car with them. Suddenly, Ammon appeared again, his voice carrying across the quiet street as he berated Mona and pointed his finger on her. Paul's stomach churned as he watched Ammon attempt to force Mona into the car, his grip on her arm visibly tightening. The scene unfolding before him was like something out of a nightmare, made all the more horrifying by its stark reality. Unable to stand by any longer, Paul made a decision. He stopped the video recording and dialed 911, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before him. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears as he waited for the call to connect. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice was a stark contrast to the chaos Paul was witnessing. This is Dr. Paul Revere, he said, his voice low but urgent. He was acutely aware of the need to remain undetected. I'm at the corner of 7th and Oak Street. I'm witnessing a woman being subjected to exploitation. It's the same woman from the incident at my dental clinic earlier today. Please, you need to send officers immediately. Are you in any immediate danger, sir? The dispatcher asked, her voice professional and steady. No, I'm in my car, observing from a distance, Paul replied, his eyes still fixed on the struggle happening just yards away. But please, send undercover officers if possible. We need to catch them unaware. Understood, Dr. Revere. We're dispatching units to your location now. Please stay on the line and do not approach the subjects. Paul's grip on the phone tightened as he watched Mona continue to struggle against Ammon and the men in the car. One of the men had reached out, trying to pull Mona into the back seat, while Ammon pushed her from behind, restraining her legs with both of his hands. The scene was horrifying in its brutality, and Paul felt a surge of helplessness wash over him. Just as Paul thought he couldn't bear to watch any longer, he saw two unmarked vehicles approach from opposite directions. They smoothly pulled up, blocking the black car from both front and back. The precision of their movement spoke of careful planning and execution. In a flurry of movement, 4 plainclothes officers emerged from the vehicles, their badges glinting in the streetlight as they identified themselves. Police! Everyone freeze! Paul watched in a mixture of relief and anxiety as the officers quickly took control of the situation. Ammon attempted to flee, but one of the officers was quicker, intercepting him and expertly handcuffing him as shock and anger contorted his face. Meanwhile, the 2 men from the car were ordered out at gunpoint, their hands raised in surrender. The street, which just moments ago had been steeped in quiet desperation, now buzzed with intense activity. Feeling a surge of adrenaline, Paul got out of his car, his heart racing as he made his way toward the group gathered on the street, identifying himself to one of the officers. I'm Dr. Revere, the one who called this in, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. As he explained the situation to the officer, Paul couldn't help but notice Ammon, handcuffed and restrained, glaring at him from the back of one of the police cars. The man's eyes were filled with a hatred that sent a chill down Paul's spine. Ammon let out a harsh laugh, his voice dripping with venom. Look at you, you pervert, hypocrite dentist, just waiting for a chance to steal my girl and get free services. An officer quickly silenced Ammon, warning him to keep his mouth shut or face additional charges. Anything he said could be used against him in court. The threat hung in the air, a reminder of the serious legal consequences that awaited him. Paul turned his attention to Mona, who stood trembling as a female officer spoke to her gently after they had rescued her from the car. While he felt a wave of relief at seeing her safe, it was tempered by the harsh reality that her ordeal was far from over. One of the officers turned to her. "Listen, we're letting you go this time," the officer said to Mona, his tone serious. "But if we catch you working illegal services for men again, you'll end up in the same place as those guys." Mona nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand," she replied softly. "I promise I'll stay away from the streets." The officers informed her that she would need to come to the police station with them while everything was still fresh in her mind. When Mona asked if she was going to jail with Amon, they assured her that she was not. They just needed to take her statement and have her sign some documents. They offered to escort her there and would take down her personal details, contact number, and address as assurance that she would not return to work on the street in the future. "So, officer, what's going to happen to Amon?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What if he comes after me?" The officer shook his head, his eyes filled with understanding. "We'll make sure that doesn't happen. He'll be locked away for a long time. We found an unregistered illegal gun on him, along with evidence of exploitation. He's looking at a minimum of 10 years behind bars." Mona nodded, and Dr. Paul could see the tension in her face begin to melt away. Her shoulders relaxed, and a faint smile crept to the corner of her lips as she realized that she was finally free from Eamon's grasp. One of the officers radioed in the request for a backup patrol car, while the other approached Mona, offering her a reassuring smile. The two cruisers, already filled with the criminals, couldn't accommodate her. "It's going to be okay," the officer said gently, his voice steady and calm. "We'll make sure you get home safely tonight after you've spoken with us at the station." As they awaited the backup, one of the officers turned to Dr. Paul. "We'll contact you and your staff tomorrow for questioning and to confirm your statements," he said, his voice steady, maintaining professionalism despite the chaos of the night. Paul nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "We're ready to cooperate, whatever you need," he replied, his voice unwavering. He understood the importance of providing all necessary information, especially given the gravity of the situation. "You took quite a risk coming out here on your own, Doctor," the officer said, a note of grudging respect in his voice. "But your actions may have saved this woman's life." "I'm just doing my duty," Paul replied, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing when I knew she needed help." He glanced at Mona, who was now speaking softly with the officers, her expression a mix of relief and lingering fear. "I'm glad I was able to intervene in time." As the officers prepared to escort Mona home, Paul felt a mix of relief that she was no longer in immediate danger and a lingering concern for her safety in the days to come. He could see the weariness etched into her features, the way her shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of her experiences. This was just the beginning of a long road ahead for her, one filled with challenges that would demand strength and resilience. As the two cruisers containing the three criminals pulled away from the scene, the sound of their sirens fading into the night, a backup patrol car arrived. A fresh officer stepped out, his demeanor professional yet approachable. He quickly moved to Mona, ready to escort her home. Before she climbed into the car, she turned to Dr. Paul, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Eamon had me under control for 3 years. At first it felt like a dream relationship, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. He forced me into this life, and even though I still loved him, I was too scared to expose him." She paused, a shadow of pain crossing her face. "Without you, I don't think I would have ever found the courage to speak up." Paul was overcome with compassion for her. "You're stronger than you think, Mona. However, I strongly encourage you to seek therapy. This is not an ordinary situation. You'll need professional support to help you process everything you've experienced. I don't want you to find yourself on the street again." Mona nodded, her expression softening as she spoke. "I can't pay for therapy," she said, the words heavy with resignation. "Don't worry about that," he replied firmly. "I want to help you. I'll also take a look at your teeth at my practice. We can see what we can do for you. I'll take you on as my pro bono patient. Just come to the clinic, it'll be an open door for you." He leaned in slightly, sincerity etched across his face. "If you need help with anything, just let me know. I know it's not easy to leave this kind of work, especially with financial pressures, but we can discuss options when you come for your appointment. I want to help you figure out a way forward." Mona climbed into the police patrol car, a sense of relief washing over her as she settled into the back seat. As the car drove away, Dr. Paul turned back to his own vehicle, ready to head home. But before he could enter, he noticed a problem. One of his front wheels had punctured a nail and was slightly deflated. He sighed, shaking his head. The day's events had taken their toll on him, but as he glanced back at the retreating patrol car, he felt a sense of accomplishment. Saving a life was worth any inconvenience. Starting his engine, he began to search for the nearest tire repair shop. As he drove, he couldn't wait to share the day's events with his wife, but he resolved to fix the car first. He would tell her how a simple act of kindness had led him to confront the darkness in someone's life. As the streetlights and neon signs blurred past, Dr. Paul found himself lost in thought, a warm feeling swelling in his heart. Despite the day's challenges and the unpredictability of life, he realized how interconnected their stories had become. Each encounter, each decision, held the potential to create ripples that could lead to meaningful change. He reflected on Mona's journey and his own, understanding that even the smallest acts of courage could spark hope. This day had reinforced for him the importance of compassion and the profound influence one person can have on another's life. In a world often clouded by despair, moments of light could break through, illuminating paths to healing and redemption. It was a powerful reminder that together they could navigate even the darkest circumstances, transforming hardship into a journey of resilience and strength.